Atlantic City, September 1967. The Steel Pier Casino was electric with Saturday night energy. High rollers filled the gaming tables, celebrities mingled at the cocktail lounge, and in the main showroom Dick Van Dyke was preparing for his 10:30 performance. It should have been a normal night. Another show in a city where Dick had performed dozens of times over the years. But nothing about this night would be normal, because sitting in a private booth overlooking the showroom was Anthony "Big Tony" Castellano, a mob boss from Philadelphia with connections throughout the East Coast. Tony controlled everything from the docks of South Jersey to the construction unions of Atlantic City. He had his hands in legitimate businesses, restaurants, hotels, entertainment venues, but everyone knew where his real power came from. Tony was in Atlantic City for a meeting, business that couldn't be discussed over the phone, business that required face-to-face conversations with other men who preferred to stay in the shadows. But Tony also liked to be seen, liked people to know he was in town, liked the power that came from having his own private booth at the hottest show on the boardwalk. Dick knew who Tony was. Everyone in Atlantic City entertainment knew. You couldn't work in this town without understanding who controlled what, who to respect, who to avoid, who to fear. But Dick had always kept his distance from that world. He performed in venues that paid protection money, took bookings arranged through connected agents, but he didn't socialize with them, didn't owe them favors, didn't want to be in their debt. Frank Sinatra had complicated relationships with these men. Dean Martin walked carefully around their world. But Dick stayed clean, stayed professional, stayed separate. Until tonight. Dick's father, Frank Van Dyke, had died 2 years earlier in 1965. Heart failure at age 64. Dick hadn't talked about it publicly much. Grief was private, family was private. But people knew. In a town like Atlantic City, information traveled. People talked, and certain people paid attention to what they learned. Frank Van Dyke had been a traveling salesman and part-time circus performer, a dreamer who'd spent Dick's childhood chasing get-rich-quick schemes and carnival opportunities that never quite worked out. Dick was in his dressing room doing his pre-show routine when there was a knock on the door. "Come in." A man in an expensive suit entered, one of Tony's lieutenants, built like a boxer, with hands that looked like they'd done more than shake other hands. "Mr. Castellano would like to say hello before the show." Dick set down his drink. "Tell Mr. Castellano I appreciate the thought, but I'm preparing. I'll see him after the show if he wants. He's in his private booth, he'd like to see you now." It wasn't a request. Dick knew that. When men like Tony Castellano sent their people to fetch you, you went, or you made an enemy. And making enemies of men like Tony wasn't something entertainers in Atlantic City could afford to do. Dick stood up. 5 minutes, that's all I have." He followed the lieutenant through the backstage area, past the curtain, into the corridor that led to the VIP section. Tony was waiting near the entrance to his booth, smoking a cigar, surrounded by 4 men who looked like they'd break your legs for looking at them wrong. "Dick Van Dyke." Tony's voice boomed. He was average height but thick through the shoulders and chest, with slicked back hair and eyes that missed nothing. The king of television comedy. "Mr. Castellano." Dick shook his hand. Tony's grip was firm. Too firm. The grip of a man who needed to prove something with every interaction. "Tony, call me Tony. We're both working guys, right? From humble beginnings." "Sure. I heard your show is great. Never seen it myself. I'm not much for television, but people tell me you're very funny, very talented. I appreciate that." Tony took a puff of his cigar. "You know, I knew your family back in the day. Well, knew of them. Your old man Frank, right? The circus guy?" Dick's face remained neutral. "Is that right?" "Yeah. My cousin Sal used to run some of the carnivals that came through South Jersey. Said your father worked for him a few times. Acrobat, wasn't he? Trapeze artist or something?" "He was a performer." "Yes. And a salesman, always working some angle, always chasing the next big opportunity." Tony's voice was conversational, but his eyes were watching Dick's reaction carefully. "Sal said he was, what's the word, persistent. Always had some scheme, some way to make it big. He was a hard worker." "I'm sure he was." Tony took another puff, but it never quite worked out for him, did it? All those dreams, all those schemes, and he died pretty much where he started. No money, no success, no recognition. Something cold moved through Dick's chest. I'm not sure what you're getting at, Tony. Oh, I'm not getting at anything. Just making conversation. Tony's smile didn't reach his eyes. It's just interesting, you know, how different things turned out for you and your old man. Dick remained silent, but every instinct told him this was heading somewhere dangerous. I mean, Tony continued. Here you are, big television star making millions famous all over America. And there was Frank working county fairs and selling insurance or whatever he was doing at the end. Must have been hard for him watching his son become everything he'd always dreamed of being but never could. Tony's associates were watching now, sensing something in their boss's tone. You know what probably killed him? Tony asked, his voice taking on a mock sympathetic tone. The shame, the embarrassment of being a failed entertainer whose son became a huge success. Living with the knowledge that he just didn't have what it takes. Dean went very still. I bet he spent his last years wondering what was wrong with him. Tony continued, either not noticing or not caring about Dick's reaction. Why couldn't he make it? Why did his son get all the talent, all the luck, all the breaks? That kind of self-doubt eats at a man, literally eats at his heart until it gives out. One of Tony's associates chuckled. The others stayed silent, watching. Dick looked at Tony, really looked at him, and Tony must have seen something in Dick's eyes because his smile faltered for just a second. That's a terrible thing to say, Dick said quietly. What? I'm just being honest. That's probably what happened. No, you're being cruel. There's a difference. Tony's smile came back, but it was harder now. Cruel? I'm just stating facts. You're making jokes about my dead father in front of strangers, suggesting he died from shame or jealousy when you didn't know him, never met him. Have no idea what kind of man he was. Hey, I'm just saying. I know what you're saying and I'm telling you to stop. The corridor went very quiet. Tony's associates tensed. You didn't tell Tony Castellano to stop doing anything. Tony's face reddened. You got some nerve, Van Dyke. You know who I am? I know exactly who you are. Then you know you don't talk to me like that. I'll talk to you however I need to when you're disrespecting my father's memory. Tony stepped closer. They were face to face now. Dick could smell the cigar smoke on Tony's breath, could see the anger building in his eyes. Your father was nobody. A nothing. A failed carnival act who died a nobody. The only reason anyone even knows he existed is because of you. And even that didn't help him. He still died broke and forgotten. Dick's hands clenched into fists. Every instinct told him to swing, to punch this man in the face, to make him pay for what he'd said. But Dick didn't move, just stood there, completely still. His face calm, his voice even quieter than before. Mr. Castellano, I'm going to give you a chance right now. A chance to apologize, to take back what you said, to show that you have even a shred of decency. I don't apologize. I know you don't. But you're going to tonight, or you're going to regret it. Tony laughed. Regret it? What are you going to do? You're an entertainer, a television comedian. You think you can threaten me? I'm not threatening you. I'm promising you. If you don't apologize right now, I'm going to walk onto that stage and tell the 400 people in that showroom exactly what you just said. Tony's expression shifted slightly. So what? Nobody cares. Everyone will care because I'll make them care. I'll tell them that Anthony Castellano from Philadelphia made jokes about my dead father, suggested he died from shame, mocked his memory. And then I'll tell them that you're sitting in booth 7. I'll point you out. Make sure everyone sees your face. Tony's smile disappeared. You wouldn't dare. Try me. You've got about 30 seconds to apologize or I'm walking onto that stage. You do that, you're making an enemy. A dangerous enemy. I already have. The question is whether you're smart enough to fix it. They stared at each other. Tony's associates looked at each other nervously. This wasn't how things usually went with Tony. People didn't stand up to him, didn't threaten him back, didn't call his bluff. But here was this television comedian, this entertainer, staring down one of the most dangerous men on the East Coast without blinking. And something in Dick's voice, something in his complete stillness suggested he meant every word. Finally, Tony spoke. His voice was tight, forced, I apologize for my comments about your father. Say his name. What? Say his name, Frank. Not your father. His name. Tony's jaw clenched. I apologize for my comments about Frank. And you were wrong to say what you said. I was wrong to say what I said. Dick nodded. Good. Now you're going to go back to your booth. You're going to watch my show, and you're going to sit there quietly. No comments, no jokes, no disrespect. Can you do that? I can do whatever I want. Can you do that? Dick's voice never rose, but something in his tone made Tony stop. Fine. I'll behave. Good. Enjoy the show. Dick walked away, back toward his dressing room. Behind him he could hear Tony's associates talking in low voices, could feel their eyes on his back. In his dressing room, Dick's hands were shaking. Not from fear, from rage. Pure, white-hot rage that he'd kept contained while facing Tony. His stage manager knocked and entered. 5 minutes, Dick. Dick took a deep breath. Let it out slowly, pushed the anger down, locked it away. He had a show to do, 400 people expecting to be entertained. He couldn't bring this darkness onto the stage with him. He walked to the wings, heard the band playing his intro music, heard the announcer introducing him. Ladies and gentlemen, the Steel Pier is proud to present Dick Van Dyke. The curtain opened, the spotlight hit him, and Dick walked onto the stage with a smile on his face like nothing had happened. For the next 90 minutes, Dick was perfect. He sang every song flawlessly, delivered every joke with perfect timing, charmed every single person in that room, except Tony Castellano, who sat in booth 7 with his arms crossed, stone-faced, looking like he wanted to kill someone. Dick noticed but didn't acknowledge him, didn't make eye contact, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten under Dick's skin. After the show, Dick went straight to his dressing room. His manager was waiting. Dick, there's a problem. What kind of problem? Tony Castellano is telling people you disrespected him, that you threatened him. His people are spreading it around the casino. This could get ugly. Dick poured himself a drink. Let it get ugly. I don't care. Dick? This is Tony Castellano. He's not some drunk tourist. He's connected. He's dangerous. You can't just... I can and I did. He made jokes about my father. About Frank. Nobody does that. I don't care who they are. But Dick, no buts. I'm not apologizing. I'm not backing down. If Tony wants a war, he can have one. But I'm not letting anyone mock my father's memory. Not for any reason. Not from anyone. His manager left, shaking his head. Dick sat alone in his dressing room, thinking about Frank. Frank had been far from perfect. He'd chased dreams that never materialized, pursued schemes that always fell through, moved the family from town to town following opportunities that existed more in his imagination than in reality. But he'd also been the man who taught Dick how to perform, who showed him that making people laugh was a gift, who believed in Dick's talent even when Dick didn't believe in himself. Frank had worked in circuses and carnivals. True, but he'd also been a dreamer who understood that entertainment was about bringing joy to people, about creating moments of magic in ordinary lives. When Dick got into television, Frank had been proud, never jealous, never resentful, just happy for his son. They'd stayed close. Dick had helped Frank financially when he could, had made sure Frank had a comfortable apartment, had been there for him during his final illness, and when Frank died, Dick had been devastated, had cried more than he'd cried since childhood, had felt a hole in his heart that never quite healed. So when Tony Castellano made jokes about Frank being ashamed, about Frank dying from embarrassment, it was the worst possible thing he could have said. If there was one thing Dick wouldn't tolerate, it was someone mocking his father's memory. The next morning, Dick got a call from someone he'd never expected to hear from. Dick, this is Sal Marconi. Sal was Tony's boss, the head of the Philadelphia family that controlled most of South Jersey. If Tony was dangerous, Sal was terrifying. Mr. Marconi, I heard about what happened last night with Tony. Did you? He told me everything. What he said about your father, how you handled it. I wanted to call you personally. Dick waited. Tony was out of line, Sal said. Way out of line. Making jokes about a man's dead father. That's not how we do business. That's not who we are. Dick was surprised. I see. Your father, Frank. I remember him. Good man. Hard worker. Sal's respect, he had mine too. What Tony said was disrespectful to Frank's memory and disrespectful to you. Thank you for saying that. Tony's going to apologize to you properly, in person, and he's going to make sure everyone knows he was wrong. That's not necessary. Yes, it is. In our world, respect matters. Family matters. What Tony did violated both of those things. He needs to make it right. 2 days later, Tony Castellano showed up at Dick's hotel. Dick? Can we talk? Dick let him in. Tony looked different, smaller somehow, less intimidating. I came to apologize. Really apologize. Not the forced thing from the other night. Dick nodded. I'm listening. I was wrong. Dead wrong. What I said about your father was cruel and stupid. I don't know why I said it. Maybe I was trying to get under your skin. Maybe I was just being a bully. But it was wrong. Tony sat down heavily. Sal told me. He remembered your father. Said Frank was a good man who worked hard and treated people with respect. That's not what I said about him. I dishonored his memory and I dishonored you. Dick remained silent. I wanted you to know something, Tony continued. My own father died when I was 16. Worked himself to death trying to provide for our family, and if someone made jokes about him the way I made jokes about your father, I'd have killed them. You had every right to do what you did. Tony looked directly at Dick. You showed more class in 5 minutes than I've shown in 5 years. You defended your father's honor without disrespecting yourself. That takes real strength. Dick felt some of his anger beginning to fade. Thank you for saying that, Tony. I want to make this right. Not because Sal told me to, but because it's the right thing to do. Your father raised a hell of a man, and any father who raised a son like you deserves respect, not mockery. They shook hands. This time Tony's grip was respectful, not aggressive. One more thing, Tony said as he was leaving. If anyone, and I mean anyone, ever disrespects your father's memory again, you let me know. They'll answer to me personally. Years later, Dick would reflect on that night as one of the most important of his career. Not because of the confrontation itself, but because of what it taught him about standing up for what mattered most. In 1985, Dick was honored at a dinner in Atlantic City. Tony Castellano, now an elderly man running legitimate businesses, was in the audience. After the ceremony, he approached Dick. You probably don't remember me, Tony said. I remember you, Tony. I wanted to thank you. Thank me for what? For teaching me something important that night. You showed me the difference between being strong and being cruel, between having power and abusing it. That changed how I handled things for the rest of my life. Dick smiled. I'm glad something good came from it. Something good did come from it. My grandson's named Frank, after his great-grandfather. But every time I look at that boy, I think about your father too. About how we should honor the people who came before us, not mock them. They talked for a few more minutes, 2 old men who'd found wisdom in an unlikely place. When people asked Dick about that night in Atlantic City, he never presented it as a story about his own courage. Instead, he talked about Frank. About a man who'd chased dreams and fallen short but had still managed to raise a son who understood the difference between right and wrong. My father wasn't a success by conventional standards, Dick would say. But he taught me the most important thing anyone can learn, that your worth isn't measured by your achievements, it's measured by how you treat other people and how you stand up for the people you love. Tony Castellano made a joke about Dick Van Dyke's dead father that night in September 1967. Dick's calm response shocked everyone. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was so controlled, so measured, so absolutely unwavering in its defense of family honor. Dick didn't yell, didn't threaten violence, didn't lose his temper. He just calmly explained what was unacceptable, calmly demanded an apology, and calmly explained the consequences if that apology didn't come. That's real strength. Not the kind that comes from weapons or intimidation or organized crime connections, but the kind that comes from love, from principle, from knowing exactly what you stand for and refusing to compromise on it. Dick Van Dyke knew who he was. He was Frank Van Dyke's son, and nobody, absolutely nobody, was going to disrespect Frank's memory without answering for it. That's the man Dick was. That's the son he was. That's the legacy he carried forward. When someone attacked his father's honor, Dick became immovable, unstoppable, and utterly committed to defending the man who had given him life and taught him how to live it with dignity. A mob boss made a joke about Dick Van Dyke's dead father. Dick's calm response shocked everyone because it showed them what real strength looks like, not in attacking others but in defending the people you love with everything you have. That night in Atlantic City, Dick Van Dyke proved that the strongest people aren't those who inspire fear, but those who inspire respect. And the most powerful response to cruelty isn't more cruelty. It's the kind of calm, unwavering dignity that makes bullies realize they've picked the wrong person to mess with. Frank Van Dyke would have been proud of his son that night. Not because Dick won a confrontation, but because he honored his father's memory with the same strength and decency Frank had tried to instill in him from the very beginning. That's the real story. That's what mattered. That's Dick Van Dyke. But the story didn't end that night in Atlantic City. The impact of Dick's stand rippled through the entertainment world in ways no one could have predicted. Word spread quickly among performers, agents, and venue owners about what had happened at the Steel Pier. Dick Van Dyke had stood up to Tony Castellano and lived to tell about it. More importantly, he'd done it with dignity and tact. Other entertainers began to take notice. For too long, many performers had accepted that working in cities controlled by organized crime meant swallowing your pride, overlooking insults, and accepting whatever treatment came your way. Dick had proven that didn't have to be the case. 3 weeks after the Atlantic City incident, Dick was performing at a casino in Las Vegas. Before the show, a young comedian named Joey Romano approached him backstage. Joey was nervous, clearly struggling with something. "Mr. Van Dyke, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Joey. What's on your mind?" "I heard about what happened with Tony Castellano in Atlantic City. How you stood up to him when he insulted your father." Dick nodded. "What about it?" "Well, I'm having a similar problem here. There's this guy, connected guy, who's been making jokes about my mother. She died last year, cancer. And this guy, he keeps saying things, awful things about how she died, about our family being poor, about how she'd be ashamed of me doing comedy." Joey's voice was shaking. "I don't know what to do. If I stand up to him, I could lose work, could get hurt. But listening to him mock my mother, it's killing me inside." Dick looked at this young man, seeing his own pain reflected in Joey's eyes. The fear, the anger, the feeling of being trapped between safety and honor. "Joey, let me tell you something. My father taught me," Dick said. "There are some things in life that are more important than safety, more important than money, more important than career advancement. Your mother's memory is one of those things." Dick put his hand on Joey's shoulder. "You don't have to handle it the same way I did. But you do have to handle it, because if you don't stand up for her, who will? And if you let people mock the woman who gave you life, what does that say about the kind of man you are?" Joey nodded slowly. "You're right. I know you're right. Being scared is normal," Dick said. "But being scared doesn't give you permission to dishonor the people you love. Find your courage, Joey. Find your voice, and use them both to protect your mother's memory." 2 days later, Dick heard that Joey had confronted the man who'd been mocking his mother. The conversation had been tense, but ultimately successful. The man had apologized and agreed to stop making the jokes. Joey's reputation among the other performers had grown considerably. Word of these incidents began to spread. Dick Van Dyke was becoming known not just as a talented entertainer, but as someone who stood up for what was right. Venue owners began treating performers with more respect, knowing that Dick and others like him wouldn't tolerate abuse. In 1972, 5 years after the Atlantic City incident, Dick received an unexpected phone call. It was from Frank Castellano Jr., Tony's son. "Mr. Van Dyke, you probably don't know me, but I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For what you did with my father back in '67. That night changed him. Changed how he treated people, how he conducted business, how he raised me." Frank's voice was emotional. "My father told me that story 100 times, how you defended your father's honor, how you showed him what real strength looked like. He said it was the most important lesson he ever learned. Your father was a good man, Frank. He just needed reminding. He was a different man after that night. Still tough, still in business, but he never again used cruelty when he could use respect. He never mocked someone's family, never kicked a man when he was down. Frank paused. And he taught me the same thing, that real power comes from lifting people up, not tearing them down. That the strongest thing you can do is defend people who can't defend themselves. Dick felt a warmth in his chest. I'm glad something good came from that confrontation. More than good. It changed generations. I've got kids now, Mr. Van Dyke, and I'm raising them the way my father raised me after that night, with respect for family, respect for memory, respect for the people who came before us. In 1989, Dick was performing at a charity event in Philadelphia. After the show, an elderly man approached him. Dick recognized him immediately. It was Sal Marconi, the old boss who'd called him years earlier. Dick, you got a minute for an old man? They found a quiet corner backstage. Sal looked frail, but his eyes were still sharp. I wanted to tell you something before I die, Sal said. What you did that night with Tony, it changed things. Not just for Tony, but for a lot of us. Sal's voice was quiet but clear. See, in our world we got used to thinking that fear was respect, that intimidation was strength. But you showed us something different. You showed us that real respect comes from character, real strength comes from principle. Dick listened carefully. After that night, I started running my business differently. Still tough when I had to be, but not cruel. Still firm, but not heartless. And I taught my people the same thing. There's a line you don't cross. Family is sacred. Memory is sacred. You don't mock a man's dead father. You don't disrespect a man's mother. You don't attack what's sacred to people. Sal smiled slightly. We started calling it the Van Dyke rule. Don't attack what people can't defend. Don't mock what people can't replace. Don't dishonor what people hold sacred. Dick was amazed. I had no idea. You wouldn't. You're not the kind of man who looks for credit. But I wanted you to know that night you defended your father's honor. You changed how a lot of dangerous men thought about honor itself. When Tony Castellano died in 1995, Dick was surprised to be invited to the funeral. He almost didn't go, but something told him he should pay his respects. At the service, Tony's grandson, a boy of about 12, approached Dick. Are you Dick Van Dyke? I am. My grandpa told me about you. He said you taught him how to be a better man. The boy looked up at Dick with earnest eyes. He said that being strong doesn't mean hurting people. It means protecting people. And that the strongest thing you can ever do is defend someone's memory when they can't defend themselves. Dick knelt down to the boy's level. Your grandfather was a wise man, and he loved you very much. I know. And he loved your father too, even though he never met him. He said your father must have been a great man to raise a son like you. Dick felt tears welling up in his eyes. Thank you for telling me that. As Dick walked away from the funeral, he thought about the strange chain of events that had started with a cruel joke in a casino hallway. How one moment of standing up for what's right had rippled outward, changing lives and perspectives in ways he could never have imagined. Frank Van Dyke had been dead for 30 years by then, but his influence lived on, not just in his son's success, but in the lessons about honor and dignity that had spread from one confrontation to countless other lives. That's the real power of defending what's sacred. It doesn't just honor the past, it shapes the future. When Dick Van Dyke refused to let a mob boss mock his father's memory, he wasn't just standing up for Frank Van Dyke. He was standing up for the principle that some things are too important to compromise, too precious to let slide, too sacred to allow others to attack. And in defending that principle, he helped others find the courage to do the same. From Joey Romano to Tony Castellano to Sal Marconi, to countless others who heard the story over the years, Dick's calm response to cruelty became a template for how to handle such situations with dignity and strength. A mob boss made a joke about Dick Van Dyke's dead father. Dick's calm response shocked everyone. But the real shock came years later when people realized that one moment of quiet courage had created waves of positive change that lasted for generations. Frank Van Dyke may have died thinking his dreams hadn't come true, but through his son's courage, his legacy became bigger than any dream he could have imagined. He became the father who taught America that some things are worth defending, no matter the cost. That's the real story. That's the real power. That's what happens when someone has the courage to say, not my father, not on my watch, not ever. Dick Van Dyke said those words in 1967. People are still learning from them today.